Hello, everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel, I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So, if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I appreciate it if you gave this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see future content like that. And you might notice that my setup is ever so slightly different today. I am recording on a different device as of right now, and the reason for that being that this is my Halloween special for this year. Welcome. Halloween is one of my favorite holidays, if not probably my favorites, because I am a huge fan of horror movies, and I love fall as a season in general, and just the vibe of Halloween is always a lot of fun. So last year I counted down my top 10 favorite horror movies, and this year I'm going to continue on with a horror movie trend, because that's where really I think it's most fun to do Halloween content, even though there's some cool music content out there as well for sure. And today I am going to be making a tier list, and this tier list is going to be of all sorts of different horror movies. It's going to be horror movies from all over the place. I found a tier list that I think has a lot of good variety. Now, I'm not going to be doing every single movie on this particular tier list. There will be some that I will skip over just because I haven't seen them or anything like that. This is going to be probably a slightly bit of a longer video. Okay, so here we are with my tier list. And as you'll notice, there's all sorts of horror movies here, like a crazy amount. So I am not going to be doing everything here, obviously, but I will go with the stuff that I have seen, and I will basically sort of give my brief opinions on it and then say where it goes in the tier list. Now, you'll notice that here at the bottom that there are these three sections of haven't seen but not interested, haven't seen, no opinion, and not interested. I'm not really going to be using these particular segments except when I'm pushing up a movie to the tier list. I'll start the movie there so that you aren't getting any spoilers on what my opinion on that particular movie is. Let's go ahead and start with 10 Cloverfield Lane, actually. Now, I'll admit it has been a while since I've seen this movie, but I still feel like I've seen it recently enough that I can give a fairly proper opinion on it. I really enjoy this movie overall. I think it is a pretty cool interpretation of the Cloverfield story. It is decidedly different than the found footage one that was the originator of this Cloverfield series. I think John Goodman is particularly great at this and gives a pretty menacing and memorable performance. And the main actress in this is also pretty great as well. I think the ending really works, even though it does feel maybe a little bit disconnected from the rest of the story. And I personally actually don't like this one quite as much as the original. I know that's probably maybe a little bit of a controversial opinion. Overall, I do think this is a really solid horror movie, and I think this is a positive place to start. So I'm going to be putting this in the B tier, the really good tier, because I do enjoy this movie overall. Now, let's move on to 28 Days Later. This is another movie where it has been a while since I have seen it, but I think it's a really solid zombie flick. I think that it really obviously inspired a lot of different other zombie movies, so I think that's a great part of it as well. And it does definitely have a unique vibe, and honestly, a lot of modern-day zombie films still aren't necessarily able to match up to this one. And honestly, this is going to be another B-tier movie for me. It's just not one that I return back to much, but I do think it's really good, and I think it deserves all the praise it's gotten, so I can't really complain too much here. Now, next, we have Sweeney Todd. This is a really fun movie. I think one of the better musical adaptations. It does play things very over the top, obviously, but that is sort of the purpose of this musical. It is meant to be sort of crazy and out there, and I think all in all, the performances are really good in here. I do enjoy Johnny Depp in this. I think this is one of his better performances before he started becoming a more mediocre actor. And I think Helena Bonham Carter really plays well here. This is somewhere between an A and a B for me. I think I'm actually going to put this in A, believe it or not, because I really do think that it dedicates to what it does. I think it is just one of Tim Burton's most interesting movies, and I think there's just not a whole lot to complain about here. Next, now we're going to move on to American Psycho, and this is another fun one, in my opinion. Christian Bale performance that I think has a lot of respect given to it, and I think clearly for really good reason. This is a great performance by Bale, and he really just goes in for the satirical elements. I think he does great, and I think the commentary in it is well done. This is probably another A tier for me. Now, next, let us move on to Candyman. I think I saw it for the first time ever last year, and I know this is one of those cult classic horror movies. I know it's not as like revered as necessarily like the Halloween movies or the Friday the 13th movies. It's not nearly as popular as those. Maybe revered is the wrong word, but popular would be the right word. I think it's clear that someone like Jordan Peele was inspired by this movie when he made Get Out. And Jordan Peele has said as such himself. I really like the sort of fairy tale elements in this movie as well, the sort of mythical elements that it has. I think it gives it an interesting edge. I'm going to give this one a B because I don't think this movie is particularly scary necessarily, and it isn't one of the more effective horror movies for me, but I think the social commentary really brings it up a tier above a C tier for me because of what it is talking about and how it presents itself, and also the person that plays Candyman. Now, next we've got Cloverfield, which I'm going to be brief on this one because I already sort of talked about it with Cloverfield 10 Cloverfield Lane. And even though I did say that I like 10 Cloverfield Lane better, I still actually don't consider Cloverfield that much better than it. It is a little better to me because I like the found footage aspect of it, but it's not like an incredible tier above it or anything. Let's go ahead and move on to Evil Dead 2. Of course, a iconic movie, one that is loved by so many, and many would consider it to be the best of the Evil Dead franchise. And I have to say that I think I agree. I do think this is the best of the Evil Dead franchise, and this one is so much fun. I think it's nearly flawless. Well, it has the best combination of horror comedy I've probably seen in any horror comedy movie. I don't know if any other horror comedy quite matches up to this one. Just some of the iconic lines in here, and the creature design is incredible. As much as I really respect the original Evil Dead, I just think Evil Dead 2 is so obviously a cut above it, and it's sort of hard to deny. Now, I have an MB right now, I'm just moving it up, but I think this one is honestly S tier. This is one of my favorite horror movies out there. I just think it is so much fun, and I just love it. And also, I'm going to try to sort of rank these movies around based on what I think is like the top A tier movies, top B tier movies, so on and so forth. So I'll be switching that around as I see fit. But let's go ahead and move on now to, let's see, what do we have next? Next, we have Happy Death Day. Had one of the most viral trailers that I think a horror movie has ever had. And it does have some very trendy stuff for social media, especially with the idea that this person is living their life over and over again. But nevertheless, even with its popularity, this movie just didn't really do a whole lot for me. I didn't find it to be particularly interesting in one way or the other. I just don't think it really does that much interesting in how it combines horror and comedy. It's sort of like the opposite of Evil Dead 2 in some ways, because I don't think this movie's comedy is super well done. Happy Death Day is just one that isn't very memorable to me, and one that I honestly sometimes forget that I've seen because it's just not a particularly memorable horror movie for as viral as it got. So I'm going to put this in C because I do think there's some entertaining aspects to it, but I just don't think it works as well as some people might think it does. It's just not necessarily for me. Now, let us move on to I Am Legend. Once again, this is a movie where I really don't have a particularly strong opinion on it one way or another. Will Smith is fine in it, I guess, but it's once again a movie that just doesn't leave a huge impression on me one way or the other. It's just sort of there. It's a movie that exists, and it's one that I enjoyed enough, but it's not one that really blew my mind one way or another. So I'm just going to put this in a quick C tier because I just don't really have a definitive opinion on this one way or another, I'll be honest. Now, let's go ahead and move on to Let Me In. Now, this one is pretty controversial, I think, because this is, of course, a remake of Let the Right One In. And some people don't like this one because they think that the foreign language original is far better, and just gets the vampire concept, the romantic vampire concept down a lot better. And I do agree with that, but I don't think Let Me In is a bad movie either necessarily. I think this is a pretty good remake and has some pretty good elements in it. And I think the story between the child and the vampire, while there are definitely some very obviously creepy elements there when you look too deep into it, I think it works well enough. And I think there are definitely some tense moments that work pretty well. I think it's solid enough for what it does. I am probably going to put this one into C tier as well. I think it is not quite good enough to be B tier, especially when you put it up against Let the Right One In, which is just a far better movie in every way possible. But I did enjoy what this one had to offer, and I think the performances are really good. Now let's move on to Mama. Uh, this is another one where it has been a while since I've seen this, but I am sadly going to probably have to put this one into D tier. I think there's some cool concepts that this movie starts out with, but really, when the reveal happened, it just didn't really stick out to me in any particular way. Now, let us move on to Psycho. If you saw my top 10 movies of last year, then you know where I'm going to put this one. This is quite honestly my favorite horror movie of all time. I think it is an Alfred Hitchcock classic. And even though obviously we didn't have color quite yet when Psycho was out, or if it was starting to be on its way, and I can't remember which, but I think this movie works at its best in black and white. And if you've seen the color remake of Psycho, then you know why the black and white works so much better. The way Alfred Hitchcock just uses the black and white to his advantage to create some very foreboding scenes works super well. It adds up to the mysterious vibe that this movie has too. And I mean, Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates, one of the best performances out there. And like I said last year, if you haven't watched the TV show Bates Motel, I would highly recommend that. Psycho is obviously going to be going in S tier for me, and unless something here makes me think otherwise, which I don't think it will, Psycho is going to be my highest S tier that I can possibly get. I absolutely love this movie. Next, we've got Smiley. This is a movie, of course, that has Shane Dawson in it. It was sort of like a YouTuber movie, a movie that a lot of YouTubers promoted back in the day. And just immediately, I'm going to be putting this one in F tier. I think this movie is terrible. Not very scary at all. The acting is just pretty bad from everyone except for our main character, who actually seems to be trying, and she's been in other movies too. She's actually a pretty solid actress, but everyone else here just can't act to save their lives. I'm sorry. And I think partly it's because of the bad writing, but also just some of them just aren't great actors. And the plot is just silly. It is trendy horror to the extreme, just having this trendy sort of creepy looking character, but also sort of silly looking character. And the movie coasted on that concept alone. Sleepy Hollow, another Johnny Depp movie, and another one that I actually really like. I think this movie has also a really good atmosphere. I think it is eerie and foreboding. And while the scares aren't as flat out obvious as maybe some other horror movies out there, I still think this movie is pretty creepy in what it does. So I'm going to be putting this one in a B tier, and probably pretty high up in the B tier too, because I do enjoy this movie quite a bit. Now let's go ahead and move on to our next, which is Scream 2. Now I'm not sure why Scream 2 is in here before the original Scream, but the original Scream is in the list later on, which I will, of course, talk about. But Scream 2, I do like the Scream movies, but I'll admit Scream 2 is one of the ones that I consider to be a bit weaker. I didn't really care for the twist as much in this one. I think it has some fun elements in it, and I do think Scream overall is probably the most solid horror franchise out there. I'm going to probably put this one high C tier. Not as good as Let Me In, but I'm probably going to put this high C tier because I just don't really find anything particularly stand out about this movie, but I can't say that I hate it either. It's just one of those movies that's sort of there for me once again. Now, that's really all I've got to say about that one, to be honest. I just don't have a whole lot of thoughts on it. Now let's move on to The Boy. This is one where I'm just going to very quickly probably put it in D tier. It is not... I don't know. It's not like garbage tier, but the movie just has a lot of cliches in it, especially with the doll concept. And the ending has some pretty fun moments in it. It's pretty climactic feeling, but it's one of those horror movies that just came and went without much thought for me. It has some very cliche jump scares. And I mean, just doll movies overall aren't that scary to me. So, yeah, that's about all I have to say about that one. Now, let's go ahead and move on to The Purge. The Purge is another one of those trendy horror movies. The Purge has actually gotten way more popular than I would have ever expected it to. And the reason I say that is that The Purge itself, even though the concept is really cool, that for one night, all crime is legal and people can do whatever they want, including murdering people, but they don't really do much to deliver on the concept. They don't even really do much to have commentary on it. It's just a movie that really doesn't stand out in the horror landscape for as interesting of a concept as it could have. And the multiple sequels it had, I'll be honest, none of them ever caught my fancy. I never saw any of them besides the first movie because the first movie just didn't interest me. And the movies did pretty well. I mean, they were very low budget. And I think for that reason, that's why they kept making them, because they were so cheap. And they're just sort of the definition of those horror movies that just sort of existed and came out every year for a while. It seems like maybe, just maybe, they're finally done with them. But nevertheless, this one is probably going to be D tier for me as well. Let's go and move on to Signs. This is an M. Night Shyamalan movie, of course, one that people consider to be one of his best before he sort of went down the route of being a very disastrous director. And I do like this one, although I don't think it is as strong as maybe some people give it credit for. I do think it's good, and I think it's a cool alien movie, and there are definitely some very memorable shots in here. I think Joaquin Phoenix's performance is pretty good. This does have some pretty cool cinematography from M. Night. I think what it does with aliens is interesting, although the twist does admittedly underwhelm me a little. I don't really care for the twist, and it makes the aliens look sort of dumb in context of the movie. So I'm sort of torn on this one. I don't know whether to put it in C or B. I'm probably going to put it in C. Okay, now let's move on to The Witch. Now this is a movie where my opinions have changed quite a bit. I started out feeling very mixed on this movie, and it is an example of an A24 movie where there's a lot more implied than there is shown, and there's a lot of stuff that you have to interpret yourself. It is based on a folklore fairy tale as well, so some very mystical and bizarre elements in here too. But as I've thought about this movie more and as I've considered it more, I actually do really enjoy this one quite a bit. Anya Taylor-Joy, this was the movie that introduced me and many others to her, and her performance is excellent in this. I'm glad that she has only grown from here, but this is still a standout performance for her, in my opinion. I think she's still really good in this, and I really like the way they develop her character. It's really interesting and pretty fun. This movie is very creepy in parts. It is very atmospheric. It isn't one of those jump scare movies, and it comes from this 2010 age of horror where it's more like elevated horror is what it's called. Although I think that this movie isn't as pretentious as some other elevated horror movies try to be. The fact that I've thought about this movie more and more over the years is what is going to make me put it ultimately A tier. All right, I have skipped over a couple because I don't want this video to go on for forever and a day, but next we've got Alien. Once again, if you saw my top 10 horror movies, then you know my feelings on this one. I adore this movie. It is one of the best horror movies of all time. Ridley Scott just made something that is incredible. And to anyone who says a space movie can't be a horror movie, I think they are full of it and absolutely insane, because when you see this movie, how can you not be scared by it? I also do think this movie benefits from having a great ensemble cast. Lots of interesting characters to latch on to here, including a young John Hurt. And while I do actually like Aliens better personally, I still think Alien is a pretty much pitch perfect movie in what it does. Absolutely love it. A definite S tier for me. One of the best horror movies of all time, undoubtedly. Now, next, let's move on to Nightmare on Elm Street. I'll be honest, I'm not actually the biggest fan of the slasher movies overall. I know that's probably a bit of a hot take for some, because I know the slasher movies are considered to be some of the biggest. I mean, Freddy, Michael, Jason, all those slashers out there are considered to be pretty top tier in terms of horror, cool dream sequences that I think are visually interesting. This movie just didn't really pop out to me in one way or another. It didn't really catch me as like a movie. I didn't understand why this one had so much love and praise given to it, when I do actually think there are better Freddy movies out there. I think New Nightmare is actually a pretty excellent Freddy movie, but this one, it just didn't really do much for me in one way or another. I'm going to put it in a C tier because I did find there to be some fun sequences. We are going to move on to A Quiet Place. This is John Krasinski's directorial debut. Of course, I think most people are familiar with this one. This has been one of the most popular horror movies of the past few years, and I think it is for good reason. I think this is a superb movie. I think it is legitimately tense in many moments. It's very simple at its core, but the simplicity works. It didn't really need much else. And I think having us attach on to this central family and really care for them really does help this movie and make you feel like it has some actual weight to it. So I am going to put this movie in a very solid A tier. I like this one quite a bit. Next, we've got Annabelle. And this one's immediately going into F tier for me. I cannot stand this movie. I mean, the reason the Conjuring movies are so good themselves, the first two especially, is because James Wan made them, and he's one of the best horror directors out there. So it doesn't surprise me that they tried to expand the franchise, but I mean, with James Wan not attached to these movies, they became immediately worse, and Annabelle is probably the worst of any of the Conjuring adjacent movies I have seen. The characters make stupid decisions. The doll is not particularly scary in this one. The directions it goes are just what you would expect beat by beat for a horror movie like this. It feels very cheap and it looks very cheap. Bad performances all around. It's just so surprising that the second Annabelle movie in the series is actually so good. It's actually a movie I just saw yesterday, which is crazy. I saw it for the first time yesterday, actually. And I know that's surprising considering that I am a horror fan, but I have never seen this one, even though it's considered pretty iconic. And after seeing it, I can definitely understand why. This movie is very creative, and it takes some cliched horror elements, but upends them. And while the movie might maybe feel a little full of itself at times, saying like, see how clever we are and stuff, the fact that it's having so much fun at the same time and being shameless with the fun it's having makes me sort of forgive those elements that can feel maybe a little pretentious. I mean, the ending in particular is some of the most fun I've had in a horror movie in recent memory. It is just so crazy and what happens in the ending, and it is not at all what I was seeing coming, but it worked out so well. I'm going to put this one in a very strong B tier. It's not quite A for me, and I feel like if I put it in A, it would be because of recency bias, but I did really enjoy this movie, and I imagine this is one I'll return to whenever the Halloween season comes around, because it does have those immediate Halloween vibes to it as well. Child's Play. Let's talk about this one. Now, I'll admit, I wasn't looking forward to this one when I watched it for the first time, because I'd heard so much about this one, and I was just like, how can Chucky really be that scary? He's a very small doll. With Child's Play, it is a different ballpark for me. I think it's because this movie knows what it is, unlike Annabelle and the Boy. It doesn't play itself seriously, instead going for a very cartoonish feel. And even the person, Brad Dourif, who voices Chucky, he's clearly having such a ball with his character and making him so over the top. So I can't really complain too much in that regard. This character is clearly meant to be cartoonish, and I did really like the sort of mystery vibe this movie had going for a while. When one of the characters was murdered in the movie, there was originally sort of a mystery going on of whether it could be the child because of the small footprints, and I liked that aspect of it. And even though the movie is funny, I do actually find Chucky to be a bit creepy in places, for as silly as he is and for as silly as he looks. There are some scary elements in this movie that work surprisingly well. I think this one is deserving of its cult status. I actually like it pretty well, and I think it's a pretty strong B tier movie for me. The Conjuring. Yes, we were just talking about Annabelle, but here's a movie that started it all, The Conjuring movie, and oh my gosh, this movie is still so good to this day. I think it works so well still. It is just, it's one of the best modern horror movies out there. James Wan is just on the top of his game here. Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga's performances are wonderful, and the way they build the scares in this movie is so good. It has classic horror written all over it. I think this one's going to be remembered for a long time to come. And for me personally, I'm just going to go out and say it. I think this is an S-tier movie for me. It's not as good as the other 3 S-tier movies up here, but I do really love this one. While we're talking about James Wan, let's talk about Dead Silence. Now, this is one of the lesser-known James Wan movies, and this is another doll movie, so you might expect me not to like this one, but I actually don't hate this one that much. I will admit it is definitely one of James Wan's weaker movies, but there are some pretty creative elements in here, and I'll admit I do like the twist. I'm probably going to put this at the bottom of C tier, though, because I do acknowledge that this movie isn't great by any means, but I did have an undeniably fun time with it, and it's interesting to see what James Wan was doing with his earlier work. I will also say that. I'll be honest. Okay, The Conjuring 2. So, once again, another James Wan movie. We are going to have some more of those coming up, I'm sure. But I think The Conjuring 2 is pretty dang close to The Conjuring. I don't think I like it better than The Conjuring necessarily, but the scares in it might be a little scarier, if I'm being honest. The Crooked Man scare is so good, and the climax of this movie is great, and the Nun might just honestly be The Conjuring's best horror villain that they have in any of their series. I'm going to be giving this one a pretty strong A tier. I think this one is just, it's another great film from James Wan and shows him to be just one of the best horror creators out there. I just don't see how you could say he's not. Okay, so you will see that I've moved up several movies. I am sorry, this video is probably going to go on for a while, like I said, because I could just talk about horror movies all day. So if you ever want to stop this video, I really don't blame you. If you lose interest at some point, that's fine. But I'm going to be keeping on moving because this is a Halloween special after all. So let's go ahead and talk about Drag Me to Hell. This is an interesting one. This is a Sam Raimi movie, and it is very Sam Raimi in every sense of the word, and it is very over the top. I mean, this movie is sort of crazy. I remember me and my cousin were watching this one, and we were sort of shocked by all the stuff that was going in front of us on the screen. Very strong B tier for me. Also, let's go on and move on to Halloween, the original Halloween. Once again, if you've seen my top 10 horror movies, then you know my feelings on this one. And I feel like this one really needs no discussion whatsoever. It is an S tier for me. And probably at number 3 in terms of my S tier movies that I'm talking about. I love Michael Myers in this. I love just the concept of the movie, and I feel like no other Halloween movie has really come close to getting Michael Myers right like the first one has. Once again, I've said this before, I don't really have any particular preference about slashers, and I think Jason is the weakest in my opinion. And I know this movie is iconic for a reason. It is a movie that sort of introduced the cliche of when teenagers are having sex, and you can guarantee that someone is going to come and kill them. And there's a reason why Jason is doing the killing of teenagers who are having sex in this movie. There's a motivation, which I do appreciate, but the movie is just pretty dull to me. Sadly, I'm going to put this in a high D tier. I know some people are going to be furious with me for that, but I just didn't really care for this one. This is a Mike Flanagan movie. Mike Flanagan just knows how to do horror, and he knows how to honor really good horror franchises. That's sort of his mission statement in many ways, especially with some of the TV shows he's made for Netflix, all of which I have liked to some degree, although I have not finished The Midnight Society, which is his newest show that he has out. I've started it, pretty interesting, but that's neither here nor there. Dr. Sleep is the sequel to the original The Shining, and I think it does what it does pretty well. I mean, it is based on nostalgia a lot, and when we go back to the house, all that nostalgia is coming from Stanley Kubrick's movie, but I think it does stuff pretty well, and I cannot, it's hard for me to resist Ewan McGregor. I just like him too much to really say one way or another that I wouldn't watch a movie with him. I think I would watch almost anything that Ewan McGregor is in because I love him as an actor, and I think he's great in this. And there's a lot of great moments in this too. I'm not going to talk about the original It, the one that was actually more like a TV show-ish, sort of, and sort of not. I'm going to be talking about the one that came out in the 2010s. And I think this movie is great. I think it is definitely one of those movies that is popular for a reason because it has some more accessible horror elements in it for sure. But Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise is just superb. The cold open of this is one of the best horror sequences I've seen in any movie to date. I think the cold open alone makes this movie worth coming out. And while I don't like the sequel as much, and even in the book I've heard that when the kids become adults, it's not as interesting. I think the first half of this It series is great, and I think it is a very confident horror movie in what it does. I'm going to put it a little lower because there's some parts that I don't love about it, and the CGI can be a little excessive, but I do really enjoy this movie. I will say that. Get Out, Jordan Peele's directorial debut, one that has been loved for its social commentary, and I think for good reason. I think it also has some legitimately creepy sequences, so I am going to put this one in A tier. Next is Hellraiser. This is another interesting one for me, and this is another one where probably people aren't going to like my opinion on it, but Hellraiser just didn't do anything for me when I first saw it, besides be very confusing. I didn't really care for this one's concept. I sort of get what it was going for, but also it just didn't really make me interested in its story, and it just felt bizarre for the sake of being bizarre. Now, the creature designs were pretty cool. I liked Pinhead, but once again, there were sort of just not enough moments with them either. I will admit, I did appreciate just how dedicated it was to going there and having some crazy moments. But I just didn't really buy what it was going for at the end of the day. It just didn't really vibe with me one way or another. So I'm going to be putting this one in a C tier. Sorry about that. And it's a pretty low C tier at that for me. Now, next, let's move on to Mother. This one is one I have a tough time talking about because there are some scenes in this that make me angry, and I think they're supposed to make me angry, but also I don't like that the director is forcing me to have that emotion and just being very obviously manipulative. Now, I like Darren Aronofsky. I think he's a pretty good filmmaker, but I think this is one of his weaker films. I don't even dislike Jennifer Lawrence's performance in this. I actually think it's fine, as is Javier Bardem's. I think they're both pretty good in this, but the obvious allegory just makes me uninterested, and I feel like the message just isn't executed as well as it could be, especially with some of the shock factor sequences that I just don't care for. I can't quite put this in F tier because I think there are some good elements of it, but I just never really liked this one. And now let's move on to another controversial film, Hereditary. Now, this one was loved by critics, but hated by audiences. And I think for the reason that this movie is probably the most A24 movie out there. I'll admit, when I came out of this movie, I didn't really like it. I wasn't really sure if I understood what was going on. But then I rewatched it, and my opinions changed quite drastically. I actually ended up really liking this movie, and there are some parts of this that are pretty dang terrifying. There are some scenes that really send chills up the spine. But even on rewatch, there were still some parts that I was just really confused as to what they were going for. And out of the movies that Ari Aster has made, I actually prefer Midsummer a little more. I'm going to be putting this in pretty high B tier, probably the highest B tier, because it is close to an A tier for me. But those elements that bother me still do bother me, so I can't really put it much higher than that. Next, let's talk about Gremlins. This is more of a Christmas movie than a Halloween movie to me, admittedly, because of the fact that it is taking place during Christmas. It's a very lovable movie at the end of the day. It is a strong B tier for me, nevertheless. I'm going to put it maybe a little lower B tier than the rest because it is not what I would consider a horror movie in the traditional sense. It is more like a Christmas horror movie than a Halloween horror movie. So that's why I'm putting it a little lower, even though I do really enjoy this movie. Now, next, we have Insidious. This is one when I was talking about my top 10 horror movies that I gave an honorable mention, and a pretty significant one at that. I love, love, love this movie. I think it is another one of James Wan's best, and another one that just shows him as being a great director. And man, I really almost want to put this one in S tier because of how much it inspired me to love horror. I hate that I'm not quite putting it in S tier, but there are some small elements that don't hold up quite as well today as they did when I first saw it. Like the main creature, as scary as he is on his first appearance, he does become a little cheesier later on. And some of the child acting isn't the greatest, but the sheer creativity of this movie just can't be denied. And with Saw, it's going to be the same thing where I almost want to put it in S tier because I love how this just established James Wan as a director, and I think Jigsaw is terrifying because of how mysterious he is. And this movie gets lumped in with all the rest as torture porn, but it is not. It really isn't. It's much more subtle. It plays things much more subtly than any of the others. And I love both the main characters. Carrie Elway is great in this. I'm going to have to put this one in a strong A as well. It's just great. Okay, so these next ones are going to be the last ones I talk about unless I change my mind. But yeah, I do want this video to end at some point. So let's go ahead and move on to Midsummer. Like I said, I like this one better than Hereditary. I think I got the vision of what this one was going for much better than Ari Aster. And you can't really go wrong with Florence Pugh. So this is going to be a pretty strong A tier for me. Probably not better than Conjuring or The Witch, so I will put it right here. Maybe not even better than A Quiet Place or American Psycho, but it is a very solid A tier for me, and I like the cult vibe of it, and I love the concept that the horror is taking place in the brightness of the daylight rather than in the dark. I think it works pretty well in that regard. Now next, Scream. I'm not going to do it on this movie too much, since I already talked about Scream with movies, and I already sort of talked about it with Scream 2. But this one is, I mean, very clearly going to go in the S tier. I love this movie. I think it is a great murder mystery, a great horror movie. The cold open is iconic. Ouija, Origin of Evil, another Mike Flanagan movie, and once again showing that he will take some franchises that are potentially bad and actually do something interesting with them. I'm probably going to put this in low B. There are still some elements that it's like, oh yeah, it's a Ouija movie, so it's not that great as other B tier movies here, but I think Mike Flanagan does enough cool stuff with it to make it work. And the creature design in this is pretty freaking awesome as well. I like Daniel Radcliffe's performance in this. I know a lot of people were still feeling him out at this time because he had just come off the Harry Potter franchise, and they were trying to see what he could do outside of Harry Potter. And I think, especially after this movie, he proved that he could be a great actor outside of that franchise, and I think he does well enough here. I also like the atmosphere of this movie, but I don't find this one to be particularly memorable. I think it is probably a C tier, just not particularly interesting to me in one way or another. I like the story, but I don't really find it to be super memorable. The Shining, I mean, this one is pretty dang close to S tier for me. I'm going to put this really high A. I really do love this movie a lot. If The Conjuring is an honorable mention for me, then this one probably needs to be A tier, whereas The Shining needs to be S tier, because I did, in fact, put The Shining in my top 10 horror movies of all time, and I do think it is deserving of that. I think this movie is excellent. Jack Nicholson's performance is awesome, and I just love it. It's great. I mean, what else can I say? There's so much stuff that's been said about The Shining, and I feel like I'd just be beating a dead horse by saying what's great about it. Trick or Treat. This is going to be an immediate S tier for me as well. Trick or Treat is just iconic to me. It is a movie that I loved from the first time I saw it. I think it is the most Halloween of Halloween movies out there. Sam is such a fun character, such a fun horror character, and I love how each of the stories in this anthology movie connect to one another. I just, it's so creative. The Strangers, this one's going to be a pretty quick C tier for me. Probably better than Dead Silence, I Am Legend, and Happy Death Day, maybe even Scream. Um, this one was better than I was expecting it to be because I know a lot of people don't really love this one and think it's sort of a cliched home invasion movie, but I actually think it's a pretty good one, and I think I understand why it is one of the more loved of the home invasion genre, but the characters are a little stupid at the same time. The Thing, man, there are so many iconic horror movies out there, aren't there? I mean, come on, S tier. Obviously, this movie is great. I love the creature design. John Carpenter's score is excellent. His directing is excellent. This is just another superb movie, and I love the idea that this creature can just make itself look human, and you aren't sure who the creature is, whose body he is inhabiting. And it taking place in the winter is a novel idea as well. You don't see that many winter horror movies out there these days, and I think that makes this movie pretty unique in that regard. This one is just superb. I really have no problems with it. Jaws, I'm going to pass over this one pretty quickly because I know people are going to be mad at me for this one, but sorry, C tier for me. I don't think it's one of Spielberg's best, and it is not for me. I understand why it is popular, but it is not for me. Okay, moving on. I'm sorry, but Jaws is just not a movie for me. The Babadook. This is another high S tier for me. I'm going to be honest. Probably the next highest S tier after Psycho. It is one of my favorite horror movies, as I said in my top 10 horror movies. And yeah, I love this one so much. I just love its concept. I love the ruminations on grief it has and how the Babadook is sort of symbolic of that. I think it's one of the best symbolic horror movies out there. Probably the best symbolic horror movie I've seen. And I love it. I think it's pretty frightening and has great performances all around. Definitely one of my favorites. The Sixth Sense. This one is going to get an A for me as well. Probably one of my higher A's too. The twist works so well, especially after watching it a second or third time. The twist only gets better as you see all the clues popping up of where the twist is and how it's panning out. It's very clever, and I think undoubtedly M. Night's best movie. I think he's not going to ever match up to this one, which is a tough thing to do when this is your movie. This is one of your first movies. It gets such huge success. It's going to be hard to match up to that. The Ring. This one's interesting for me because I do like this movie, but I don't find it to be particularly memorable either. I think I'm probably going to put this one in the B tier. I like the creepy videotape concept, and I like where that goes, but it's something that just doesn't interest me as much as I would like it to, I'll be honest. And The Descent, which is probably the one we're going to end off with, but I'll be here again, obviously, if we aren't. But The Descent, this is probably I don't know. This one's another tough one. This one could be a B. I think it has some really eerie elements to it, and then when it jumps out and goes into the violence, this movie is pretty intense in that regard. And it taking place in a cave is so cool as well. I mean, I love that. Probably that's enough to convince me to put it at very high B. Maybe I don't know. Maybe right here would be fair. But I really like The Descent as well and think it is just wonderful. It is a great movie. Just because I feel like The Descent was maybe a sort of uninteresting one to end on, I will do one more movie, and then that'll be it. Now, I know there's a whole bunch more down here, and you can always create your own. There's plenty of great movies here that I didn't talk about, plenty of probably bad ones too, but Silence of the Lambs, this is another movie I saw recently, and I honestly think this one is pitch perfect, and is probably an S tier for me. I mean, I think it's almost clearly an S tier for me. Anthony Hopkins' performance is wonderful. Jodie Foster is great in this. There are some really eerie moments in here that send utter chills up my spine. Buffalo Bill is a pretty menacing character as well. And I sort of really love the inescapable darkness that this movie has. It is truly an eerie one for sure. And I think I'm going to put an ending on it there. All of the S tiers, I feel pretty satisfied with where all these are. I don't think I'd really change the positioning of much of them. And most of these are movies that I already have in my top 10 movies anyway, although there's a couple here that I hadn't talked about before, like Evil Dead 2 and The Silence of the Lambs. Then here is my A tier movies. All great films as well. I mean, some of my secondary favorites. The Sixth Sense is up there with some of my favorite horror movies as well. I think I may have put that in my top 10, but I think it's fair to keep it in A tier. Then here's my B tier, which is my biggest tier, which makes sense because I am, like I said, a pretty big fan of horror. And then C, which has quite a few as well, and I'm pretty satisfied with all the C. Then the D, and then there's only really 2 movies that I talked about that came out to an F tier, which I think both of those are more than deserving of an F tier. But I'll probably do something like this in the future for other horror movies. I'm pretty happy with this list I have right here. So yeah, this is where I'm going to end this video. If you agree or disagree with my list, let me know. And yeah, happy Halloween, everyone. This is going to be coming out either on Halloween or the day before Halloween. I'm not sure which, but it will be out on one of those days for your all's enjoyment. And I hope you all enjoyed my tier list. Until then, I will see you all in the next video.